when an arrogant bank manager publicly humiliated a quiet customer for his shabby appearance. He had no idea he was belittling Keanu Reeves, the man who owned the bank. What started as a routine day at Midtown Financial Bank quickly turned into a lesson in kindness and humility, reminding everyone that appearances can be deceiving and humanity is priceless. March 15th, 2022, began like any other day at Midtown Financial Bank in downtown Los Angeles, a place known for its cold efficiency and rigid formality. The staff bustled about, tending to customers, while the bank's manager, Edward Coleman, maintained his usual air of superiority, ensuring every interaction reinforced his authority. But that ordinary day was about to take an extraordinary turn. A man in a worn leather jacket stepped quietly into the lobby, his hands tucked into his pockets. He blended into the crowd, exuding a calm presence that seemed almost out of place amidst the sterile chaos of the bank. Little did anyone know, this man was Keanu Reeves. Yes, that Keanu Reeves. Before I reveal what happened next, and trust me, you won't believe the twists that follow, I'd love to connect with you. My amazing viewers, where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever been inspired by an act of kindness that left you speechless, hit that like button, because this story will not only inspire you, it might just restore your faith in humanity. As Keanu approached the counter, his relaxed demeanor and modest attire didn't seem to sit well with Edward Coleman. Edward, who prided himself on running a tight ship, immediately sized up the unassuming man. To him, Keanu looked like a waste of time, a drifter with nothing of value to offer. "Do you have an account here?" Edward barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. "If not, I suggest you find the exit." The bank fell silent, the atmosphere thick with tension. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a faint smile, the kind that carried wisdom and patience. "I'm just here to ask a few questions," he replied softly, his voice calm but resolute. But Edward wasn't having it. "Questions won't get you anywhere if you don't belong here," he scoffed, his words dripping with disdain. "This isn't a charity." The room grew impossibly quiet as David Montgomery, the CEO of Midtown Financial Bank, strode confidently toward Keanu Reeves. His polished suit and commanding presence made it clear he was someone of authority. But his warm smile and outstretched hand spoke volumes about who he was addressing. "Mr. Reeves," he repeated, his tone filled with both respect and familiarity. "What a pleasant surprise. How can we assist you today?" For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Edward Coleman stood frozen, his once unshakable arrogance now replaced with an unmistakable dread. The murmurs from the crowd of customers grew louder, a ripple of realization spreading through the room like wildfire. Keanu Reeves, the man Edward had belittled and dismissed moments ago, wasn't just a random visitor. He wasn't just a Hollywood star. He was someone far more significant to this bank. "Mr. Coleman," David continued, now turning his gaze to the manager. "I assume you're aware of who you've been addressing?" Edward's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he swallowed hard, his face paling with each passing second. "Allow me to clarify," David said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of authority. "This is Mr. Keanu Reeves, the majority shareholder of Midtown Financial Bank and the very man who saved this institution during the 2008 financial crisis." Gasps erupted throughout the lobby, and all eyes turned to Keanu. He remained composed, his expression calm and humble, as though the revelation meant little to him personally. But for Edward, the weight of those words hit like a ton of bricks. His knees threatened to buckle as the enormity of his mistake sank in. Moments earlier, he had mocked and humiliated a man who held more power than anyone in the room, including himself. I didn't realize," Edward stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked to Keanu, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. But Keanu held up a hand to stop him. "It's not about who I am, Mr. Coleman," he said softly, his tone devoid of anger but filled with disappointment. It's about how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us. That's what truly matters. Edward lowered his gaze. Unable to meet Keanu's eyes, the weight of his own actions bore down on him. And for the first time, he truly felt the shame of his behavior. But Keanu didn't linger on Edward's remorse. Instead, he turned his attention to the people around him, customers, tellers, and staff alike who were still reeling from the revelation. He wasn't interested in pointing fingers or holding grudges. He was interested in reminding everyone of something much more important: the value of kindness. Kindness isn't a currency, Keanu continued, his voice carrying a quiet strength that commanded the room's attention. It doesn't depend on how much you have or how powerful you are. It's something you can give freely, no matter who you are or where you come from. And often, it's the smallest acts of kindness that make the biggest difference. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to breathe as one, absorbing the simple yet profound truth of what he'd said. But the moment wasn't over. From the back of the room, a hesitant voice broke the silence. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves." All heads turned toward a woman holding a young boy's hand. She stepped forward cautiously, her face a mix of awe and gratitude. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I just have to thank you. You probably don't remember, but 5 years ago, you helped me at a bus station. I just lost my husband, and I didn't know how I was going to make it. You sat with me for hours and gave me hope. That day changed my life." The room was silent again, but this time, it was a silence filled with emotion. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening as he nodded. "I remember," he said simply. His words carried no fanfare, no need for recognition, just a quiet acknowledgement of a moment that had clearly meant as much to him as it had to her. The young boy tugged at his mother's hand, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. "Are you really John Wick?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension and replacing it with warmth. Keanu crouched down to the boy's level, taking the paper and signing it with a flourish. "I guess I am," he said with a grin, handing it back. "But I'm also just Keanu." It was a moment of connection, a reminder that no matter how famous or powerful someone might be, they're still human. And in that moment, Keanu wasn't a celebrity or a shareholder. He was simply a man who cared. As the interaction unfolded, Edward stood on the sidelines, his emotions a whirlwind of guilt and self-reflection. He realized he hadn't just misjudged Keanu, he had misjudged what it meant to truly lead. Being a manager wasn't about power or control. It was about serving others and lifting them up. And for the first time in his career, Edward saw himself clearly, not as he wanted to be, but as he truly was. David Montgomery, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. "Leadership isn't about titles, Edward," he said quietly. "It's about character. And today, you've been given a rare opportunity to grow. Don't waste it." Edward nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could begin to make amends, not just to Keanu, but to everyone he had ever treated poorly. As the crowd began to disperse, Keanu prepared to leave, but not before turning to Emily Carter, the bank teller who had shared her story about her mortgage. "Thank you," she said again, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Keanu smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you realize," he said. "I just gave you a push, you did the rest." With that, Keanu walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of people who would never see the world or each other the same way again. The lesson he left was simple yet profound. True worth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. As Keanu stepped outside the bank into the crisp Los Angeles afternoon, the echoes of the emotional scene inside still lingered in his mind. The warmth from the gratitude of strangers mixed with the sharp reminder of humanity's flaws, leaving him with a bittersweet feeling. He had come to the bank for a simple inquiry, but instead, he had been thrust into a situation that felt both familiar and unsettling. a reminder of the fragile line between arrogance and humility, judgment and kindness. Inside, Edward Coleman remained rooted in place, replaying the events in his mind. The shame was overwhelming, but beneath it, something deeper was beginning to stir, the faint spark of realization. He had spent years building a wall of superiority, convinced that power was the ultimate measure of success. Yet, in a single afternoon, Keanu Reeves had dismantled that belief with nothing more than quiet humility and undeniable truth. Edward turned to David Montgomery, who stood nearby, his expression thoughtful. "What do I do now?" Edward asked, his voice trembling with genuine uncertainty. David studied him for a moment before answering, his tone firm but encouraging. "You begin again," he said simply. "And this time, you lead with compassion, not control." Meanwhile, Keanu made his way down the busy sidewalk, blending effortlessly into the city's rhythm despite his fame. He wasn't one to dwell on moments like these, but something about today felt different. It wasn't Edward's arrogance that lingered. It was the woman at the bank who had spoken about how he'd changed her life at the bus station. The boy with the crayon drawing. The stories of lives he'd touched without even realizing. He was used to giving without expectation, but being reminded of the impact of those small acts of kindness made him reflect on the people who had once done the same for him. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, already knowing who it would be. Sure enough, the name Claire Harper flashed on the screen. Claire, his childhood friend and one of the few people who truly understood him, had a way of appearing in his life exactly when he needed her. He answered with a quiet "hey," and her familiar voice greeted him warmly. "You okay?" she asked, her tone a perfect blend of concern and care. Keanu smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "I'm fine," he replied, but she knew better. "You're at it again, aren't you?" she said knowingly, "carrying the weight of the world." Keanu chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "I don't want to save the world, Claire. Just enough of it to make it feel a little lighter." There was a pause on the line before Claire spoke again, her voice gentler this time. "You know, sometimes you don't have to carry it alone. Letting people in doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human." Keanu didn't respond right away. He knew she was right, but the thought of opening himself up to that kind of vulnerability felt both comforting and terrifying. "Are you in town next week?" she asked, changing the subject slightly but with purpose. "I am," he said. "Good," she replied, "because I'm taking you to dinner, and you're not allowed to say no. It's time you let someone else take care of you for once." Keanu laughed, this time with genuine warmth. "Okay, Claire," he said. "Dinner it is." As the call ended, Keanu slipped his phone back into his pocket, his thoughts drifting to Claire and the ways she had always been there for him, even when he didn't know how to ask for help. He knew he was lucky to have someone like her in his life, someone who saw through the walls he'd built and reminded him of the person he was beneath it all. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. Back at the bank, Edward stood in his office, staring out the window at the city below. He felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him, but instead of pushing it away, he let it sink in. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to justify his actions or hide behind excuses. He thought about Keanu's words, "It's about how we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us." Those words echoed in his mind, not as a reprimand, but as a challenge, a call to do better. Edward knew he couldn't change the past, but he could choose a different path moving forward. The following week, Edward gathered his staff for a meeting, something he rarely did unless it was to reprimand or enforce policy. But this time, his tone was different. He spoke not as their boss, but as someone who was learning what it meant to lead with integrity. He announced a new initiative to support struggling families in the community, using bank resources to help those who needed it most. It was a small step, but for Edward, it felt monumental, a chance to start again, not just as a manager, but as a better human being. The ripple effect of that day at Midtown Financial Bank didn't end there. Customers who had witnessed Keanu's quiet wisdom left with a renewed sense of purpose, sharing their own acts of kindness inspired by his example. And as for Keanu, he found himself looking forward to dinner with Claire in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about reconnecting with an old friend, it was about allowing himself to be vulnerable, to let someone else carry a piece of the weight he so often shouldered alone. The moments that define us often come when we least expect them, when we're forced to confront not just the world around us, but the parts of ourselves we've tried to ignore. For Edward, for Claire, and even for Keanu, that day at the bank became more than just a lesson in humility. It became a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives. And sometimes, the person you help isn't the one standing in front of you. It's the one you see in the mirror. The sun was beginning to set as Keanu walked through the streets of Los Angeles, the golden light casting long shadows on the pavement. In his pocket, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. A small, tattered envelope. He pulled it out and frowned, the edges worn and familiar. His breath caught as he saw the handwriting on the front. It was Jennifer's, a name that hadn't passed his lips in years, but one that lived in the quiet corners of his heart every single day. The envelope felt heavier than it should, weighted with memories he had tried so hard to bury. Jennifer had been the love of his life, her laughter the soundtrack to his happiest moments. But her sudden passing years ago had left a void that no amount of time or success could ever fill. He hadn't opened this envelope since the day she wrote it, choosing instead to lock it away with the rest of the reminders of a life they never got to live. How it had ended up in his pocket today was a mystery, but somehow, felt like she had placed it there herself. Keanu found a quiet bench under the shade of a tree and sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph of them together, taken on a carefree afternoon when the world felt full of endless possibilities. Jennifer was smiling brightly, her eyes full of life, and on the back of the photo, in her familiar handwriting, were the words, "Don't forget to live." His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes, the weight of her words crashing over him like a wave. For so long, he had carried her memory like a sacred burden, honoring her through acts of kindness and quiet generosity. But in doing so, he had forgotten the one thing she had always wanted for him, to truly live. The people he had helped, the lives he had touched, were all part of that promise. But he realized now that it wasn't enough. He had been giving to others without allowing himself to receive, building a wall around his heart that even kindness couldn't breach. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Claire. "Don't overthink everything. Just breathe. And don't ghost me on dinner next week. I mean it." He chuckled softly through his tears, the sound catching in his throat. Claire had always known how to bring him back to the present, to remind him that he wasn't alone, no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise. As he sat there, clutching the photograph, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked up to see Emily, the bank teller, standing a few steps away, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. I'm sorry to bother you," she said quickly, "but I found this and thought it might be yours." She held out a small, worn notebook, its cover scuffed with age. Keanu recognized it immediately. It was Jennifer's journal, a place where she had written down her dreams, thoughts, and plans for the future. He took it from her gently, his voice thick with emotion as he said, "Thank you, Emily." She hesitated, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Keanu nodded, though the tears still shimmered in his eyes. "I will be," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Emily gave him a small, understanding smile before turning to leave, leaving him alone once more with the ghosts of his past. For a long time, Keanu sat there, the notebook resting on his lap. He traced his fingers over the cover, remembering the nights they had spent dreaming together, imagining a life that would never come to be. Slowly, he opened it, flipping through the pages filled with Jennifer's handwriting. Her words were full of hope, love, and an unwavering belief in the beauty of the world, even in its imperfections. On the last page, he found a passage that stopped him cold. It was dated just a week before she passed, and it read, "Keanu, I know life will be hard without me, but promise me this: you'll keep living, not just for me, but for yourself, because you deserve to be happy. You deserve to love and be loved." Keanu closed the notebook, his hands trembling as he took a deep breath. The weight he had carried for so long began to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something different, something lighter. Jennifer's words weren't a farewell. They were a reminder, a gift she had left behind to guide him even when she was gone. That evening, as the city lights flickered on and the streets came alive with the hum of life, Keanu made a decision. He would keep his promise to Jennifer, not just in his actions toward others, but in how he chose to live his own life. He would open his heart again, let people in, and allow himself to feel the joy and connection he had spent so many years avoiding. Back at the bank, Edward Coleman was already putting his own transformation into motion. Inspired by Keanu's words, he had called an emergency meeting with his staff to announce a new initiative. The bank would be launching a community outreach program to provide financial assistance to families in need, with a focus on education and housing support. It was a small step, but for Edward, it felt monumental, a way to begin making amends for the person he had been and to embrace the person he wanted to become. As Keanu walked home, the photograph of Jennifer and the journal tucked safely in his pocket, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world was still heavy, still filled with pain and loss, but for the first time, he felt ready to share the weight. He thought of Claire, her unwavering support and gentle reminders to let himself be cared for, and smiled. The future no longer felt like an endless road of giving without receiving. It felt like a new chapter waiting to be written, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of living not just for others, but for himself. The next week arrived with a quiet anticipation. Keanu found himself standing outside a small, cozy restaurant tucked away in a quieter corner of Los Angeles. The warm glow from its windows spilled onto the sidewalk, and the hum of conversation inside carried a sense of comfort and ease. He wasn't used to being nervous, but tonight felt different. This wasn't just dinner with an old friend. It was a step toward something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. As he walked through the door, he immediately spotted Claire. She was seated near the window, her familiar smile lighting up the room. She waved him over, and as he approached, he noticed the way her presence had a grounding effect, as though she carried a piece of the past that made the present feel less heavy. "You're late," she teased, though her tone was soft, playful. "Fashionably," Keanu replied with a small grin, pulling out a chair. The dinner unfolded like a slow symphony. They talked about everything and nothing, their childhood memories, her life as a teacher in Oregon, his latest projects, and the unexpected encounter at the bank. Claire listened intently as Keanu recounted the events, her expression shifting from amusement to concern and finally to quiet understanding. "You're always trying to fix the world," she said softly, resting her chin on her hand. "But you know, it's okay to let someone fix you once in a while." Keanu hesitated, her words striking a chord he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. "I'm not broken," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire tilted her head, her gaze steady and kind. "I didn't say you were, but even the strongest people need a place to rest. Keanu, you've been carrying so much for so long. Maybe it's time to share the weight." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind only shared by people who truly understood each other. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt like he didn't have to be anything but himself. As they finished their meal, Claire reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You deserve happiness," she said simply, her words echoing the sentiment he had read in Jennifer's journal just days before. He looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw not just a friend, but someone who believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Meanwhile, at Midtown Financial Bank, Edward Coleman was following through on his commitment to change. The community outreach program he had announced was already taking shape, with plans to provide housing assistance and financial education workshops for low-income families. Edward personally oversaw every detail, determined to make a genuine impact. His staff, inspired by his transformation, began to see him in a new light, not as the cold, authoritarian manager he had once been, but as a leader who had learned the value of compassion. One of the first initiatives was to provide relief for customers struggling with mortgage payments. And Emily Carter, the teller who had shared her story with Keanu, was chosen to lead the program. "You've got the heart for this," Edward had told her during their planning meeting. "And honestly, you're the reason I started thinking differently about what this bank could do." Emily, though surprised by his sincerity, accepted the role with pride, eager to pay forward the kindness she had once received. Back at the restaurant, Keanu and Claire lingered long after their plates were cleared, their conversation drifting into the kind of introspection that only came late at night. Claire leaned back in her chair, studying him thoughtfully. "So, what's next for you?" she asked. Keanu shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in a while, that doesn't scare me." Claire smiled, her expression softening. "Good," she said, "because the world needs more of you, Keanu. Not just the parts that give, but the parts that feel. You've got a lot of love to share, and I think it's about time you let yourself share it." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, and he realized she was right. It wasn't just about helping others, it was about allowing himself to be helped, to be loved, and to embrace the fullness of life, even when it felt messy or uncertain. As they left the restaurant, the night air was cool and crisp, the city alive with its usual buzz. Keanu walked Claire to her car, their conversation lingering in the quiet pauses between steps. Before she got in, she turned to him, her expression serious but hopeful. "You've got a lot of chapters left to write," she said. "Don't forget to make them good ones." Keanu watched her drive away, her words echoing in his mind as he walked home under the glow of the streetlights. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. Instead, he felt something lighter: possibility. Jennifer's journal, Claire's unwavering belief in him, and the small moments of connection he had shared with strangers at the bank had all converged into one simple truth. Life wasn't meant to be carried alone. The next morning, Keanu woke to the soft light of dawn streaming through his window. He reached for the notebook on his bedside table, flipping to Jennifer's final message. Her words still brought a lump to his throat, but now, they also brought a sense of peace. He smiled, setting the notebook down as he prepared for the day ahead. As he stepped out into the world, Keanu knew he couldn't change everything, but he could change enough to make the world feel a little brighter, a little lighter, and this time, he would do it not just for others, but for himself, too, because sometimes, the greatest gift you can give is the one you allow yourself to receive. The freedom to live, love, and heal. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of that moment at the bank continued to spread. Edward Coleman's transformation became a testament to the power of humility and second chances. Under his leadership, the bank's new community initiatives began changing lives. One family at a time, Emily Carter, who had once been on the receiving end of Keanu's anonymous generosity, now became a beacon of hope for others. She often thought about how one man's quiet kindness had not only saved her home but also inspired her to believe in the goodness of people. And Keanu? He stepped into his new chapter with a renewed sense of purpose. His life didn't drastically change. It didn't need to, but something in him had shifted. The weight he'd carried for years felt lighter, not because the world had become less heavy, but because he had finally allowed himself to share the load. Claire's words, Jennifer's journal, and the gratitude of strangers had all reminded him of one undeniable truth. No matter how much you give to the world, it's okay to let the world give something back. One sunny afternoon, Keanu found himself sitting on a park bench, a notebook in hand. This time, it wasn't Jennifer's, it was his own. He had decided to start writing again, capturing the moments that made life meaningful. A group of kids ran past, laughing and chasing each other, their joy infectious. He smiled, thinking about how life had a way of offering small, beautiful reminders to keep moving forward. As he watched the world go by, a young woman approached him hesitantly, holding her phone. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaky. "But are you Keanu Reeves?" He looked up and gave her the warm, humble smile that had become his signature. "I am," he said simply. She held up her phone, showing him a photo of her family. "You don't know me," she began, "but years ago, you donated to the hospital where my little brother was being treated. You helped save his life. I just wanted to say thank you." Keanu's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I'm glad he's okay," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, before walking away, leaving him once again with the overwhelming yet comforting realization that small acts of kindness can echo far beyond the moment they are given. The camera pans out, capturing Keanu sitting alone on the bench, a figure of quiet strength and resilience. The world around him is alive with motion, a stark contrast to his stillness. Yet, there's no sadness in his solitude, only peace. And as he closes his notebook, the faint sound of children laughing in the background, the message becomes clear. Life is about connection. It's about the little things, the moments, the people, the kindnesses that make the world a little better, one day at a time. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been on the receiving end of an act of kindness that changed your life? Or maybe you've been the one to give without expecting anything in return. Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And if this tale of humanity and redemption moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's spread more stories that remind us of the power of compassion, hope, and second chances. Thank you for watching. And remember, the world is a little brighter when we all choose to care.